Before starting the video, I request to like the video and leave a sweet comment. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dark Index. Tonight we are sharing 7 very scary true stories from Washington State's rainforests that will make you wonder what is really hiding in America's loneliest and wettest wild places. These are not made-up stories, but real things that happened to people who were alone in places where the trees grow so close together that sunlight almost never gets through and the constant rain covers up every noise. Each story has been carefully put together from people who were actually there and checked through witness statements and written proof. The old rainforests of Washington hold dangers that most people will never see. And maybe that is a good thing. From the Olympic Peninsula to the Cascade Mountains, these forests have seen horrible things that don't make sense. If you like real horror stories that will keep you awake at night and make you think twice about your next hiking trip, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest true terror stories. After you listen to these frightening stories, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences in lonely wilderness areas. Now, get comfortable as we look into the darkness that grows where civilization ends and the endless rain begins. Story 1. The Watcher in the Cabin. Hunter was 24 years old when he decided to take a job as a forest worker in the Olympic National Forest. There was something about the never-ending rain and tall evergreen trees that pulled him in. Something basic that drew him away from the noise of Seattle and into the wet silence of the wilderness. Finding affordable housing in the city had become nearly impossible, and when the Forest Service offered him a job that included a small cabin deep inside the rainforest, he said yes right away without thinking twice. The job was simple enough. Watch trail conditions, write down wildlife activity, and take care of the remote ranger station that served as a checkpoint for hikers going into the backcountry. What Hunter didn't expect was just how isolated the job would truly be. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through moss-covered Douglas firs and western red cedars, so huge that their trunks seemed to eat the daylight. The trees grew so close together in this part of the Olympic Peninsula that even at noon, the forest floor stayed in constant twilight. Rain fell all the time, sometimes as a light mist that hung in the air like smoke, other times as heavy downpours that beat against the metal roof of the cabin so hard that Hunter could barely hear himself think. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive down muddy logging roads that became dangerous during heavy storms. Cell phone reception didn't exist. The only connection to the outside world was a satellite phone kept locked in a metal box at the ranger station, only for emergencies. Hunter got used to his new routine surprisingly easily. He woke before dawn each morning, made coffee on the small propane stove, and spent his days hiking the network of trails that crossed the forest. He wrote down fallen trees, checked for signs of erosion, and occasionally met backpackers who were always thankful for his knowledge of the land. The work was physically hard, but mentally peaceful. At night, he came back to the cabin, cooked simple meals, and read by lamplight until he was too tired to stay awake. The isolation that might have driven others crazy felt like a gift to Hunter. He had always been comfortable being alone, and the forest seemed to welcome him as one of its own. It was during his 3rd week at the cabin that Hunter first noticed something was wrong. He had returned from a long day of trail work to find that things in the cabin had been moved. Not a lot, but enough to notice. The coffee mug he had left on the counter that morning now sat beside the sink. A book that had been closed on the table was now open to a different page. The chair at his small desk had been pushed back as if someone had been sitting in it. Hunter stood in the doorway, water dripping from his rain jacket onto the wooden floor, and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Maybe he had moved these things himself and forgotten. Maybe the isolation was already playing tricks on his memory. He checked the door and windows. Everything was locked, just as he had left them. The next morning, Hunter convinced himself that he had imagined it. But when he returned that evening, the unsettling feeling came back even stronger. This time, the changes were more obvious. His toothbrush had been moved from the bathroom to the kitchen counter. A pair of socks he had left on the bed were now arranged neatly on the floor beside the door. Most disturbing of all, the small framed photograph of his family that he kept on the nightstand had been turned face down. Hunter felt his heart beat faster as he moved through the cabin, checking every corner, every closet, every space large enough for someone to hide. He found nothing. The doors and windows stayed locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, no muddy footprints, no sign that anyone had been inside. Yet the proof was clear. Someone or something had been in his cabin while he was away. Over the next several days, the incidents got worse in frequency and strangeness. Hunter began making mental notes of exactly where he left his belongings each morning, creating a kind of test to figure out if he was losing his mind or if something truly unexplainable was happening. Each evening when he returned, he found that items had been moved, rearranged, or moved to different rooms entirely. His shaving razor appeared in the kitchen drawer. A flannel shirt he had hung in the closet was draped over the back of a chair. A can of soup from the pantry sat in the middle of the bathroom floor. The movements seemed random at first, but slowly Hunter began to see a pattern. The items were always things he used daily, things that were personal to him. It was as if someone was studying his habits, learning his routine, making a list of his life. The night Hunter discovered the footprints changed everything. The rain had stopped for the first time in nearly a week. He had gone to bed early, tired from a particularly hard day of clearing fallen trees from the main trail. Sometime around 2 in the morning, he woke to the sound of branches snapping outside the cabin. He lay perfectly still in the darkness, listening. The forest was never truly silent, but this sound was different. It was on purpose, rhythmic, the clear sound of footsteps circling the cabin. Hunter slipped out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see nothing but shadows and the unclear outlines of trees. The footsteps continued, moving slowly around the outside of the cabin, stopping occasionally, as if the walker was examining the structure. Hunter stayed at the window for nearly an hour, barely breathing, until the sounds finally faded into the distance. At first light, Hunter pulled on his boots and stepped outside to look around. The ground around the cabin was soft mud, still soaked from weeks of rain, and the footprints were clearly visible. They formed a complete circle around the cabin, passing beneath every window, stopping at both doors. The prints were fresh, made sometime during the night, and they belonged to a boot similar to the ones Hunter wore. But what chilled him to his core was realizing that whoever had made these prints had stood at each window for several minutes. The impressions were deeper where the person had paused, as if they had been watching him sleep. Hunter photographed the prints with his personal camera and measured them as best he could. They were roughly size 11, slightly larger than his own feet. He followed the trail into the forest, but after about 50 yards, the prints simply vanished. There was no sign of where the person had come from or where they had gone. The following week brought a new level of terror that Hunter had not imagined possible. He began finding his belongings outside the cabin, arranged in the forest as if someone was building a shrine. A t-shirt he had been missing for days was draped over a low-hanging branch just beyond the tree line. His toothpaste was squeezed out in a line along a fallen log. A pair of his underwear was stuffed into a hollow in a cedar tree. Each discovery sent waves of sickness through him. The violations were becoming more intimate, more invasive. Whoever was doing this was not just watching him. They were collecting pieces of his life, taking souvenirs, marking territory. Hunter reported the incidents to his supervisor using the satellite phone, but the response was dismissive. Animals could move things, the supervisor said. Bears were known to enter cabins. Perhaps a curious raccoon was rearranging items. The footprints could belong to a hiker who had gotten lost and stumbled upon the cabin in the dark. But Hunter knew better. This was not the work of animals or lost hikers. This was on purpose, calculated, and deeply personal. He began locking himself inside the cabin as soon as he returned each evening, blocking the door with furniture, checking and rechecking the windows. Sleep became nearly impossible. Every sound sent his heart racing. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. He requested an immediate transfer, but the Forest Service paperwork moved slowly. There were forms to fill out, approvals to get, replacement staff to find. In the meantime, Hunter was told to stay at his post and continue his duties. The job had to be done, regardless of his personal discomfort. It was during his final week at the cabin that Hunter discovered the photographs. He had returned from his morning rounds to find an envelope taped to the outside of the door. His name was written on the front in neat block letters. Inside were 4 Polaroid photographs, and when Hunter looked at them, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The photographs showed him sleeping in his bed. The images had been taken through the cabin window on different nights, judging by the different shirts he wore and the different positions he lay in. In one photograph, his face was clearly visible in the dim light from the lamp he kept on at night. In another, the camera had captured him mid-dream, his expression peaceful and unaware of the predator watching from the darkness. The 4th photograph was the most disturbing. It had been taken from inside the cabin, from the foot of his bed, looking down at him as he slept. Whoever had taken these photos had been inside the room with him, standing over him, documenting him without his knowledge or permission. Hunter did not return to his duties that day. He packed a single bag with essential items, left everything else behind, and drove straight to the Forest Service headquarters in Port Angeles. He submitted his resignation immediately, refusing to return to the cabin even to collect his remaining possessions. He filed a formal complaint and provided copies of the photographs to local law enforcement. The sheriff's department sent deputies to investigate, but they found nothing. The cabin showed no signs of forced entry. There were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no clues as to the identity of the stalker. The footprints around the cabin had been washed away by later rains. The items Hunter had found, arranged in the forest, were either gone or dismissed as random debris. Without solid evidence or a suspect, the investigation stopped and eventually closed. In the months following his departure, other Forest Service employees reported similar experiences at the same cabin. Items moved unexplainably, footprints circling the structure at night, personal belongings disappearing and reappearing in strange locations. One worker lasted only 3 days before requesting a transfer. Another refused to sleep in the cabin at all, choosing instead to camp in a tent a mile away and only entering the structure during daylight hours. The Forest Service eventually removed the cabin from active use, citing safety concerns and structural issues, though those who worked there knew the real reason. The cabin remains standing today, slowly being taken back by the forest, its windows dark and empty. Local hikers occasionally stumble upon it and peer through the dirty glass, wondering why such a sturdy structure sits abandoned in the middle of prime forest land. Hunter never returned to the Olympic National Forest. He took a job in Spokane, far from the rain and the towering trees, far from the cabin where someone had watched him sleep and collected pieces of his life like trophies. He still has nightmares about those photographs, about realizing that he had been completely vulnerable and unaware while a stranger stood over him in the darkness. He wonders sometimes who it was and why they chose him. Was it someone who had used the cabin before, a former employee with a key and an obsession, a local resident who resented the Forest Service presence in their wilderness? Or was it something else entirely? Something that defends its territory in ways that defy human understanding? The questions remain unanswered. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. Somewhere in the depths of the Olympic rainforest, someone is still out there, still watching. still waiting for the next person foolish enough to accept a job in that isolated cabin where the rain never stops and the trees grow so thick that screams would never carry beyond their ancient trunks. Story 2. The Hunt in the Mountains. Brooklyn and Jonathan were both in their late 20s at the time, experienced hikers who thought they knew the Cascade Mountain trails. They had planned this 3-day backpacking trip for months, carefully selecting their route through some of the most remote wilderness in Washington state. The North Cascades were well known for their unpredictable weather and challenging land, but that was exactly what drew them to the region. Brooklyn worked as a graphic designer in Seattle and craved escape from the digital world. Jonathan was a software engineer who spent most of his waking hours staring at computer screens. For both of them, these trips into the wilderness represented more than fun. They were necessary reminders that a world existed beyond the limits of urban life. A world of ancient forests and crystal-clear lakes, where human concerns seemed insignificant beneath towering peaks that had stood for thousands of years. They began their hike on a Thursday morning in late September, when the summer crowds had thinned and the fall rains had not yet begun in full force. The trailhead was located at the end of a forest service road, accessible only by high-clearance vehicles. They had driven up in Jonathan's truck the night before and slept in the parking area, eager to get an early start. By 7 in the morning, they were on the trail, their backpacks heavy with food, camping equipment, and all the supplies they would need for 3 days of self-sufficiency. The plan was straightforward. They would hike 8 miles to a remote alpine lake, make camp, spend 2 nights exploring the surrounding area, and then hike back out. Cell phone service had disappeared within the first mile of the trailhead. The satellite emergency beacon in Jonathan's pack was their only connection to civilization, saved for life-threatening situations. The first day of hiking was spectacular. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, the air thick with the scent of cedar and pine. Moss hung from branches like green curtains. Ferns carpeted the forest floor. They crossed several streams on makeshift log bridges, the water running clear and cold from glacial melt higher up the mountain. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed above the tree line and entered a landscape of granite and heather. The lake came into view just before sunset, a perfect mirror of turquoise water nestled in a circle of jagged peaks. They set up their tent on a flat spot near the shore, cooked dinner on their backpacking stove, and watched the stars emerge one by one as darkness settled over the mountains. That first night passed without incident. They slept soundly, tired from the long climb, and woke to frost on the tent fly and their breath visible in the cold mountain air. After a slow breakfast, they spent the day exploring the area around the lake. They scrambled up a nearby ridge for better views, photographed marmots sunning themselves on rocks, and discovered a series of smaller pools hidden in a hanging valley above the main lake. By evening, they were back at camp, tired but content. They made dinner as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected perfectly in the still water of the lake. It was the kind of evening that justified every difficult step of the climb. Sometime around midnight, Brooklyn woke to the sound of voices. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The voices were distant, muffled, barely heard over the whisper of wind through the rocks. But as she lay there in the darkness, fully awake now, the sounds continued. Laughter, multiple voices talking over each other, the clear pattern of human conversation echoing across the empty landscape. She reached over and shook Jonathan awake. He listened for a moment, his expression confused in the dim glow of the headlamp he had switched on. They both heard it clearly now, voices somewhere out in the darkness beyond their camp, but that made no sense. They had seen no other hikers on the trail. The parking area at the trailhead had been empty except for their truck. This lake was miles from any established campsite, accessible only by difficult cross-country navigation. Who could possibly be out there? Jonathan unzipped the tent and stepped outside, sweeping his headlamp beam across the landscape. The light revealed nothing but rocks and the dark expanse of the lake. The voices had stopped the moment he opened the tent. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the pounding of Brooklyn's heart. She joined him outside, and together they scanned the area with their lights. Nothing moved, no tents were visible, no campfires glowed in the distance. After several minutes of searching and calling out with no response, they convinced themselves that the sound had been an acoustic trick of the mountains. Wind, funneled through narrow valleys, could create strange effects. Perhaps they had heard echoes of their own conversation from earlier in the evening, somehow delayed and distorted by the land. It was a thin explanation, but it was better than the alternative. They returned to the tent and tried to sleep, but Brooklyn found it impossible. Every small sound seemed louder. The rustle of the tent fabric, the distant call of an owl, the creak of settling rocks as the temperature dropped. She lay awake for hours, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, until exhaustion finally pulled her under, sometime before dawn. When they woke the next morning, the previous night seemed less threatening in the clear light of day. They joked nervously about mountain spirits and acoustic oddities while they ate breakfast and broke down camp. They had planned to spend another night at the lake, but both of them felt an unspoken desire to leave. Something about the place no longer felt welcoming. They agreed to pack up and hike to a different location, perhaps go partway back toward the trailhead and camp in the forest, where they would feel less exposed. By noon, they had packed everything and were ready to go. That was when they noticed the footprints. The lake was surrounded by a mix of granite slabs and patches of sandy soil. Near their tent site, clearly visible in a section of damp sand, were boot prints that had not been there the day before. Multiple sets of prints, at least 3 different people, judging by the varying sizes and tread patterns. The prints circled their campsite, coming within feet of where they had slept. Brooklyn felt her stomach drop as she knelt to examine them more closely. These were fresh prints made sometime during the night. While they had slept, while they had heard those voices in the darkness, people had been walking around their tent. Jonathan immediately pulled out the satellite beacon, but Brooklyn stopped him. They didn't have an emergency yet, just an extremely unsettling situation. If they called for rescue now, they would be charged thousands of dollars and possibly face fines for misuse of emergency resources. They were both capable hikers. It was the middle of the day. They had plenty of food and water. The logical thing to do was to pack up and hike out immediately, so that is what they decided to do. They shouldered their packs and started back down the trail, moving quickly, saying little. The forest that had seemed so beautiful on the way up now felt oppressive and claustrophobic. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. They made it down to the tree line by early afternoon and had covered perhaps half the distance back to the trailhead when Brooklyn stopped suddenly. She grabbed Jonathan's arm and pointed back up the trail. 3 figures were visible, perhaps 100 yards behind them, moving quickly, closing the distance. They were definitely following them. There was no question about it. The moment Brooklyn and Jonathan stopped, the figures stopped. When they started walking again, the figures resumed their pursuit. Jonathan shouted back at them, demanding to know who they were and what they wanted. No response came. The figures simply stood there, silent and motionless, watching. Brooklyn felt terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was wrong in every possible way. People didn't behave like this in the wilderness. Hikers encountering other hikers called out greetings, asked about trail conditions, engaged in the friendly interactions that defined backcountry culture. These people were hunting them. That was the only word that fit. They were being hunted. The decision to run was instinctive and mutual, and Brooklyn and Jonathan broke into a sprint, their heavy packs bouncing painfully against their backs, branches whipping at their faces as they crashed through undergrowth and leapt over roots. Behind them, they could hear the sound of pursuit, footsteps pounding the trail, branches breaking, The voices had returned, but they were no longer distant and muffled. They were close and getting closer. Brooklyn's lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest. The pack straps dug into her shoulders. But fear drove her forward with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Jonathan was just ahead of her, running with the desperate speed of prey, fleeing a predator. They had perhaps 2 miles left to reach the trailhead, 2 miles of downhill trail that felt like forever as they ran for their lives through the darkening forest. Somewhere during that frantic descent, Brooklyn made the mistake of looking back. 3 figures were running after them, moving with terrifying speed and coordination. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces hidden by hoods. They carried nothing. No packs, no gear, which allowed them to move far faster than Brooklyn and Jonathan could with their heavy loads. She screamed at Jonathan to move faster, but they were already running at their absolute limit. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Jonathan skidded to a stop and dragged her to her feet. The figures were closing the gap. 50 yards, 40. They could hear breathing now, heavy and rhythmic. Brooklyn thought with absolute certainty that they were going to die here, that whatever these people wanted, it was not to ask about trail conditions or share stories around a campfire. Then, miraculously, impossibly, they burst out of the trees into the parking area. Jonathan's truck sat exactly where they had left it 3 days earlier. They ran for it, fumbling with keys, throwing open doors, hurling their packs into the bed without bothering to secure them. Jonathan started the engine and threw the truck into reverse, then drive, tires spitting gravel as they sped down the Forest Service road. Brooklyn twisted in her seat to look back. The 3 figures had stopped at the edge of the parking area. They stood there in a line, watching the truck leave, making no attempt to chase further. Even from a distance, even in the fading light, Brooklyn could see that they were smiling. The drive down the mountain was a blur. Jonathan drove far too fast for the rough road conditions, but neither of them cared. They needed distance. They needed pavement and cell service and other human beings and all the trappings of civilization that they had been so eager to escape just 3 days earlier. When they finally reached the highway, Jonathan pulled over and both of them sat in stunned silence for several minutes. Their hands were shaking. Brooklyn realized she was crying. They drove to the nearest town, a small logging community with a gas station and general store, and called the county sheriff from a payphone outside. The deputy who took their report was skeptical but professional. He took down their information, promised to send a patrol up to the trailhead to investigate, and suggested that they might have encountered squatters or illegal marijuana growers who used the remote forest as a base of operations. 2 days later, the sheriff's department called them back. A search of the area around the lake and trailhead had revealed evidence of recent camping, including fire rings and trash, but no sign of the people Brooklyn and Jonathan had encountered. More disturbing was what searchers found near the lake. A cache of supplies had been hidden in a rock crack above the shoreline. The supplies included rope, duct tape, tarps, and several large knives. The items had been packaged in waterproof containers and appeared to have been in place for months. The sheriff told them that investigators believed the area was being used as a staging ground for illegal activities, possibly related to drug trafficking or poaching. He thanked them for reporting the incident and suggested they might have unknowingly stumbled into the middle of a criminal operation. The people who chased them were likely trying to scare them away rather than harm them, protecting their territory from unwanted witnesses. Brooklyn didn't believe that explanation for a second. She remembered those smiles as the figures watched them drive away. That was not the expression of people protecting criminal operations. That was the expression of people who enjoyed the hunt, who got pleasure from terrorizing others, who were disappointed that their prey had escaped. She and Jonathan never went back to the Cascade Mountains. They sold their backpacking gear and took up rock climbing at indoor gyms where walls were made of plastic, and the only danger came from falling a few feet onto padded mats. Brooklyn still has nightmares about voices echoing across dark water. Jonathan flinches at sudden sounds and refuses to camp anywhere that doesn't have cell phone service. They never speak about what happened to their friends or family. Some experiences defy explanation, and some truths are too unsettling to share. Somewhere in the North Cascades, perhaps still camped near that beautiful turquoise lake, 3 figures wait in the darkness for the next hikers foolish enough to venture too far from civilization. The mountains hold secrets that are never meant to be discovered, and Brooklyn and Jonathan learned that lesson in the most terrifying way imaginable. Story 3. The Rental Nightmare. The following story takes place in 2019 when Skylar was working as a wildlife researcher stationed near the Hoh rainforest. The position was a dream come true for her, a chance to study one of the most biologically diverse temperate rainforests in the world while earning a modest salary that covered her basic expenses. The job required long hours in the field, tracking elk herds, documenting plant species, and collecting data on the complex ecosystem that thrived in the constant dampness of the Olympic Peninsula. The work was physically demanding and intellectually stimulating, exactly what Skylar had hoped for when she completed her graduate degree in wildlife biology. There was just one problem. Housing near the Hoh rainforest was nearly impossible to find. The area was remote, sparsely populated, and most of the available rentals were summer vacation properties that landlords refused to lease year-round to researchers. Skylar spent weeks searching for accommodation before finally finding a listing on a Facebook housing group. The post was simple and straightforward. Private cabin available for long-term rental, fully furnished, utilities included, quiet location near forest access roads. The rent was remarkably affordable, well below market rate for the area, which should have been her first warning sign. But Skylar was desperate and running out of options. The research position started in 2 weeks, and she couldn't afford to turn down the job because she lacked housing. She messaged the landlord, a man who identified himself only as David. He replied within minutes, explaining that he had recently moved overseas for health reasons and was renting out his cabin to help cover the mortgage. He couldn't show her the property in person, but his brother lived nearby and could provide access for a viewing. The cabin exceeded Skylar's expectations when she arrived for the tour. It sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by towering Sitka spruce and western hemlock. The interior was rustic, but well-maintained, with a wood-burning stove, a small but functional kitchen, and a bedroom with large windows that looked out into the forest. The furnishings were minimal but adequate. A bed, a table with 2 chairs, a worn couch, and several bookshelves filled with nature guides and field journals. David's brother, a quiet middle-aged man who introduced himself as Tom, walked her through the property and answered her questions about utilities and trash pickup. Everything seemed legitimate. Tom handed her a set of keys and told her to take her time looking around. He left before she finished exploring, telling her to lock up and drop the keys in the mailbox when she was done. Skylar signed the lease via email that same evening. David sent her a standard rental agreement. She transferred the first month's rent and security deposit, and within 3 days, she was moving her belongings into the cabin. The first few weeks were peaceful and uneventful. She settled into a routine of early mornings in the field, long hikes through dense undergrowth, tracking wildlife, and quiet evenings in the cabin, reviewing her data and preparing reports. The isolation didn't bother her. In fact, she welcomed it. After years of living in crowded apartments with noisy roommates during her university studies, the solitude of the rainforest felt like a gift. She had minimal contact with David. He sent a brief email at the beginning of each month, confirming receipt of her rent payment and asking if everything was satisfactory with the property. She always replied that everything was fine, It was during her 4th week in the cabin that David's messages began to change. The shift was subtle at first, barely noticeable. He asked about her research, expressing interest in the wildlife she was studying. Skylar thought nothing of it. Many landlords enjoyed making small talk with their tenants, and David seemed genuinely curious about the ecology of the area. She replied with brief summaries of her work, describing the elk populations and the challenges of navigating the dense forest. But then David's questions became more specific, and that was when the first threads of unease began to creep into her awareness. He asked about the blue rain jacket she wore during her fieldwork. How had he known it was blue? She had never sent him photographs. He mentioned that she kept her field notebooks on the kitchen table. How had he seen her kitchen table? He commented that she seemed to prefer tea over coffee in the mornings. How could he possibly know that? Skylar tried to rationalize his knowledge. Perhaps Tom had mentioned these details during a visit she hadn't noticed. Perhaps there were old photographs of the cabin interior that showed items she had arranged in similar locations. Perhaps David was making educated guesses based on typical researcher behaviors. But the explanations felt forced and inadequate. She began paying closer attention to David's messages, and what she discovered sent ice through her veins. He knew when she left the cabin each morning and when she returned each evening. He knew that she had reorganized the bookshelf in the living room. He knew that she had moved the couch away from the wall to access an electrical outlet. He knew details that no one could possibly know unless they were inside the cabin watching her, documenting her daily routines. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when Skylar returned from a particularly exhausting day in the field. She had hiked nearly 12 miles through difficult terrain, crossing swollen creeks and scrambling over fallen logs. She was muddy, tired, and looking forward to a hot shower and an early night. As she unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside, her phone buzzed with a message from David. The message was brief but chilling. "You should be more careful crossing Beaver Creek. The water is high this time of year, and those rocks are slippery. You could hurt yourself." Skylar stopped breathing. Beaver Creek was not on any map. It was a local name she had learned from other researchers. A small tributary that ran through the study area miles from the cabin. She had crossed it that afternoon, carefully picking her way across moss-covered stones while the swollen current rushed past her boots. No one had been with her. No one had seen her except David. Skylar didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed with all the lights on, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. The most obvious explanation was that David had installed cameras in the cabin, hidden cameras that allowed him to watch her every move, to catalog her habits, to invade her privacy in ways that violated every boundary she possessed. But how did cameras in the cabin allow him to know about Beaver Creek? That was miles away in the forest. Unless he had cameras there too, or unless he was not overseas at all. Unless he was here in Washington watching her in person, following her through the forest, tracking her movements like she tracked the elk herds. The thought was so terrifying that Skylar physically shook. She was alone in a remote cabin, surrounded by miles of empty forest, completely vulnerable to a landlord who seemed to know her every move. The next morning, Skylar began testing her theory. She placed specific items in specific locations throughout the cabin, creating a kind of trap. She left a coffee mug on the bathroom sink, a book open to page 47 on the kitchen table, and her field binoculars on the arm of the couch. She took photographs of each setup with her phone, documenting the exact placement. Then she left for her fieldwork, making a point to stay away from the cabin for the entire day. When she returned that evening, nothing had been moved. Everything was exactly as she had left it. But the message from David came an hour later. "I see you are reading about forest mushrooms. Fascinating subject. The book on the kitchen table is open to a chapter on mycorrhizal networks. The book was indeed about forest ecology, and page 47 did discuss mycorrhizal fungi. David had not only seen the book, he had read the specific page it was open to. Skylar immediately began searching the cabin. She moved furniture, examined light fixtures, checked smoke detectors, and inspected electrical outlets. She knew what hidden cameras looked like. She had seen enough crime documentaries to understand that modern surveillance devices could be incredibly small and difficult to detect. Her search took hours, and she found nothing obvious. No tiny lenses, no suspicious modifications to household items, no wires running where they shouldn't be. But the cabin was old and had many architectural features that could conceal devices. Exposed wooden beams, decorative knots in the pine paneling, vintage light fixtures with brass fittings. Any of these could hide a camera small enough to escape casual inspection. She needed professional help, but she had no idea who to call or whether her suspicions would be taken seriously. The situation escalated dramatically when Skylar left the cabin for a weekend conference in Seattle. She had informed David weeks earlier that she would be away, fulfilling the requirement in her lease to notify the landlord of extended absences. She drove the 3 hours to Seattle on Friday afternoon, attended 2 days of presentations and networking events, and returned to the cabin late Sunday evening. As she approached the driveway, her headlights swept across a vehicle parked near the cabin, a dark SUV, not one she recognized. Her heart hammered as she slowed her approach. Who would be at her cabin? The vehicle pulled away quickly, speeding down the gravel road before she could get close enough to see the license plate. She parked and ran to the cabin, fumbling with her keys, terrified of what she might find inside. Everything looked normal at first glance. No signs of forced entry, no items obviously missing or disturbed. But Skylar could feel that something was wrong. The air in the cabin felt different, as if someone had recently been moving through the rooms. She checked her bedroom and froze. Her pillow had been moved, not dramatically, just shifted slightly from where she had left it. On her dresser, a bottle of lotion had been opened and moved from the left side to the right side. In the bathroom, her toothbrush was wet, even though it had been dry when she left on Friday. Someone had been in the cabin. Someone had touched her things. Someone had used her toothbrush. The violation was so profound, so intimate, that Skylar felt physically ill. She ran outside and vomited in the bushes beside the cabin, her entire body shaking with fear and disgust. Skylar didn't go back inside that night. She got in her car and drove to the nearest town, checked into a motel, and called the police. The deputy who responded took her report, but seemed skeptical of her claims. Without evidence of forced entry or theft, there was little the police could do. They couldn't prove that anyone had been in the cabin. They couldn't prove that David was surveilling her. They couldn't even prove that David was in Washington rather than overseas, as he claimed. The deputy suggested that perhaps she had misremembered the position of items before leaving for the weekend. Perhaps the toothbrush had been wet because she had used it Friday morning and moisture remained. Perhaps she was experiencing stress-related paranoia from living alone in such an isolated location. The suggestions were infuriating and dismissive, but Skylar had no concrete evidence to contradict them. She hired a private investigator the next day, spending money she couldn't afford from her modest researcher salary. The investigator was a former police officer who specialized in surveillance detection. He arrived at the cabin with electronic equipment and spent 6 hours conducting a systematic search. He found 2 cameras. One was hidden in a smoke detector in the bedroom ceiling. The other was concealed in a decorative wooden owl that sat on a shelf in the living room. Both cameras were wireless, broadcasting to a receiver that could be located anywhere within a half-mile radius. The investigator also discovered that the front door lock had been modified with a duplicate key cylinder that allowed David to enter the cabin at any time, even though Skylar had locked the deadbolt from inside. The evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. David had been watching her sleep. David had been watching her dress and undress. David had been documenting her most private moments for months. Armed with the investigator's report and photographs of the surveillance equipment, Skylar returned to the police. This time, they took her seriously. David was charged with multiple counts of unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass. The investigation revealed that he had never left the country. He lived in a small house less than 2 miles from the cabin, close enough to monitor the wireless camera feeds in real time. Police found dozens of hours of recorded footage on his computer. Videos of Skylar going about her daily life, completely unaware that she was being watched. They also found photographs David had taken while following her through the forest during her fieldwork. Images of her crossing Beaver Creek, images of her kneeling to examine elk tracks, images of her eating lunch beside a fallen log. He had been stalking her both inside the cabin and outside in the wilderness, a predator studying his prey with meticulous attention to detail. David was arrested and charged, but the legal process moved slowly. Skylar broke her lease immediately, forfeiting her security deposit and moving her belongings into temporary housing while she searched for alternative accommodation. The research institute she worked for was supportive and helped her find a room in a house shared with 2 other biologists. She filed for a restraining order that was granted pending the criminal trial, but the damage was done. The sense of violation, the loss of security, the knowledge that someone had watched her most intimate moments and got satisfaction from that surveillance, left scars that would take years to heal. Skylar completed her research contract, but declined an offer to extend for another season. She left the Hoh rainforest and took a position at a university in the Midwest, far from the rain and the towering trees and the cabin where her privacy had been so deeply violated. David ultimately pleaded guilty to reduced charges and served 18 months in county jail. The sentence felt inadequate to Skylar, a mere slap on the wrist for crimes that had fundamentally altered her sense of safety in the world. She never returned to Washington State, the rainforest that had once represented opportunity, and adventure now represented terror and betrayal. Sometimes late at night, when she lies awake in her apartment thousands of miles away, Skylar wonders if David is out of jail now, if he has found another victim, if some other young woman is renting that cabin and living her life unaware that eyes are watching from hidden cameras and that footsteps are following her through the forest. The thought haunts her, but there is nothing she can do. She reported what happened. She testified in court. She warned others in online housing groups about the dangers of too-good-to-be-true rental listings in isolated locations. But predators like David persist, and the wilderness that seems so peaceful and empty is sometimes home to the worst kind of human monster. Story 4, The Gas Station Stalker. This takes place in 2021 when Aaron was living in Forks, Washington, working night shifts at a 24-hour gas station on Highway 101. The town of Forks was small, isolated, and most famous for being the setting of a vampire romance series that had brought tourist traffic years earlier. But by 2021, the tourist boom had faded, and Forks had returned to its quiet existence as a logging and fishing community on the edge of the Olympic Peninsula. Aaron was 22 years old, a community college dropout who had moved to Forks from Tacoma after a bad breakup left him needing a fresh start. The job at the gas station was not glamorous, but it paid enough to cover rent on a small studio apartment and left his days free for hiking in the surrounding rainforest. The gas station where Aaron Work sat at the junction of Highway 101 and a Forest Service road that led deep into the Olympic National Forest. During daylight hours, the location saw steady traffic from tourists heading to the coast and logging trucks hauling timber down from the mountains. But during Aaron's shift, which ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, the station was often completely deserted for hours at a time. Aaron didn't mind the isolation. He spent his nights reading, watching movies on his phone, and occasionally helping the rare customer who pulled in for gas or snacks during the early morning hours. The work was monotonous but peaceful, and after the chaos of his previous life in Tacoma, peace was exactly what Aaron needed. The regular customer started appearing during Aaron's third week on the job. He was a man in his mid-40s, average height, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic appearance. He drove a nondescript silver sedan and always came in around 2 in the morning, purchasing coffee and a pre-packaged sandwich. He was polite and soft-spoken, making small talk about the weather or asking Aaron how his night was going. Aaron appreciated the company. Working alone all night could be lonely, and having a friendly, regular customer broke up the monotony. The man introduced himself as David, explaining that he worked irregular hours as a freelance writer and often found himself awake at odd times. He lived somewhere in the area, but was vague about the exact location. Aaron didn't press for details. Customer privacy was respected in small towns. Over the following weeks, David became a nightly fixture. He would arrive around the same time, purchase the same items, and spend 10 or 15 minutes chatting with Aaron before heading back to his car. The conversations were pleasant and seemingly innocent. David asked about Aaron's life, his reasons for moving to Forks, his interests and hobbies. Aaron found himself opening up, sharing details about his breakup, his struggles with college, his love of the outdoors. David was an attentive listener, offering advice and encouragement. He seemed genuinely interested in Aaron's well-being, which felt good. After months of feeling adrift and disconnected, Aaron began to look forward to David's visits, viewing them as the highlight of his otherwise tedious shift. The shift in dynamics was so gradual that Aaron didn't notice it happening. David started staying longer during his visits, sometimes lingering for 30 or 40 minutes. He began asking more personal questions. What time did Aaron finish work? Did he have a girlfriend or boyfriend? Where exactly was his apartment? Did he live alone? The questions felt intrusive when Aaron thought about them later. But in the moment, surrounded by the fluorescent lights of the empty gas station and grateful for human interaction, he answered without suspicion. David also started appearing at unexpected times. Sometimes he would show up at midnight, right when Aaron's shift began. Other times, he would arrive just before 7 in the morning, claiming he wanted to catch Aaron before he left. The frequency of visits increased from once per night to sometimes 2 or 3 times during a single shift. It was during Aaron's 6th week at the job that he first felt genuine discomfort. David had arrived around 1 in the morning and stayed for over an hour, leaning against the counter and talking non-stop. The conversation had turned strange. David asked if Aaron ever felt lonely working nights. He suggested they should hang out sometime outside of the gas station. He mentioned that he had a cabin a few miles into the forest where Aaron could come visit if he ever needed company. The invitation felt wrong in a way Aaron couldn't articulate. There was an intensity in David's eyes, a neediness that set off alarm bells. Aaron politely declined, saying he valued his limited free time and preferred to spend it hiking alone. David's expression darkened for just a moment before he smiled and said he understood. But as he left that night, he turned back at the door and said something that made Aaron's blood run cold. "I know where you live, Aaron. The apartment above the hardware store. If you ever change your mind about visiting, just let me know. Aaron had never told David where he lived. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stood behind the counter, staring at the empty parking lot where David's silver sedan had just pulled away, and felt fear crawl up his spine. How did David know his address? Had he followed him home after a shift? Had he been watching him? Aaron pulled out his phone and considered calling the police. But what would he say? A regular customer knows where I live. That wasn't illegal. David hadn't threatened him. He hadn't done anything overtly criminal. But every instinct Aaron possessed was screaming that something was very wrong. The next night, David didn't appear during Aaron's shift, and Aaron felt relieved. Perhaps David had sensed his discomfort and decided to find his coffee elsewhere. But when Aaron walked to his car in the employee parking area behind the gas station at 7 in the morning, he found a folded piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper. The note was handwritten in neat block letters. I missed seeing you last night. I hope you're not avoiding me. We have such good conversations. I feel like we have a real connection. The note was signed with David's name and included a phone number. Aaron crumpled the note and threw it in a nearby trash can, his hands shaking. This had crossed a line from friendly customer to something much more sinister. Over the following week, David's behavior escalated in ways that left Aaron terrified and helpless. David began appearing outside the gas station at unexpected times, not coming inside, but sitting in his car in the parking lot watching. Aaron would glance out the windows and see the silver sedan idling under the lights. David visible behind the wheel, just sitting there for hours. When Aaron's shift ended, David would sometimes be waiting in the employee parking area, smiling and waving as Aaron hurried to his car. Aaron started locking his car doors immediately and driving away as quickly as possible, checking his mirrors obsessively to make sure he wasn't being followed. But several times he spotted the silver sedan, a few cars behind him, maintaining pace through the empty pre-dawn streets of Forks. The worst incident occurred on a Thursday morning. Aaron had finished his shift and driven home, relieved to see no sign of David's vehicle. He parked behind the hardware store and climbed the exterior stairs to his studio apartment, exhausted and eager to sleep. But as he unlocked his door and stepped inside, he froze. Someone had been in his apartment. Nothing was obviously disturbed or stolen, but small details were wrong. His mail, which he had left stacked on the kitchen counter, had been sorted into neat piles. The coffee mug he had left in the sink was now sitting on the dish rack, washed and dried. Most disturbing of all, his bed had been made with hospital corners, something Aaron never did. He stood in his tiny apartment feeling violated and terrified, and realized that David had been inside his home. Aaron called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes and took his report seriously. They documented the evidence of unauthorized entry, photographed the rearranged items, and dusted for fingerprints, though they warned Aaron that unless they found a match in the system, prints alone wouldn't be enough to identify the intruder. Aaron told them everything about David, the escalating behavior, the notes, the surveillance. The officers assured him they would investigate and advised him to document any future contact. They suggested he might want to consider a restraining order if David's behavior continued. In the meantime, they arranged for increased patrols in the area and gave Aaron direct contact numbers for non-emergency situations. David appeared at the gas station that very night. He walked in at his usual 2-time slot, smiled at Aaron, and approached the counter as if nothing had changed. Aaron's heart was pounding so hard he thought he might pass out. He told David he was not welcome at the station anymore and needed to leave immediately. David's smile never wavered. "Why are you being so unfriendly, Aaron?" "I thought we were friends." Aaron reached for the phone to call the police. But David held up his hands in a gesture of peace. Okay, I'll leave. But you're making a mistake. We could have something special. He walked out slowly, maintaining eye contact the entire time, and drove away. Aaron didn't see David again after that night, but the fear didn't diminish. He discovered that his apartment building's exterior door lock was broken, allowing anyone to access the interior stairwell. His landlord promised to fix it, but seemed unconcerned about urgency. Aaron started barricading his apartment door with furniture and sleeping with a baseball bat beside his bed. He changed his work schedule, requesting day shifts, but the gas station owner told him night coverage was required, and he couldn't accommodate the change without hiring a replacement. Aaron seriously considered quitting, but he needed the income and couldn't afford to leave without another job lined up. The resolution came 3 weeks later in an unexpected way. Aaron arrived for his shift one evening and found 2 detectives waiting for him. They wanted to ask questions about David, whose full name they now knew. It turned out David was wanted in connection with multiple stalking cases across Washington and Oregon. He had a pattern of targeting young men who worked alone in isolated locations, befriending them, escalating to surveillance and harassment, and in at least 2 cases, attempting abduction. The detectives showed Aaron photographs of previous victims, young men who looked disturbingly similar to Aaron. They told him he was lucky. His decision to report early and get police involved had likely prevented a much more serious incident. David was arrested a month later in Oregon, where he had moved on to a new victim working at a remote truck stop. He was charged with multiple counts of stalking, burglary, and attempted kidnapping. Aaron was asked to testify in the Washington case, which he did, though the experience left him emotionally drained. David pleaded guilty to avoid trial and received a 10-year sentence. But the damage to Aaron's sense of security was profound and lasting. He quit his job at the gas station and moved back to Tacoma, unable to tolerate the isolation of Forks any longer. He struggles with anxiety and paranoia, checking locks multiple times, avoiding conversations with strangers, always scanning his surroundings for threats. Aaron shares his story occasionally on internet forums, hoping to warn others about the dangers of isolation and the predators who seek out vulnerable people in remote locations. He wants people to understand that friendliness can be a weapon, that kindness from strangers should be met with healthy skepticism, and that trusting your instincts when something feels wrong can save your life. The rainforests of Washington are beautiful and majestic, but they are also home to people who use that beauty and isolation to hunt those who wander too far from safety. Aaron learned that lesson the hard way, and he considers himself fortunate to have escaped with nothing more than psychological scars. Not everyone who encounters a predator in the darkness is so lucky. Story 5. The scratch at the door before the incident. Here is a bit of context. Hazel had been living alone in a small house on the edge of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest for about 2 years. The house was a rental, an old logger's cabin that had been renovated just enough to meet modern building codes, but kept its rustic character. Rough-hewn timber walls, a wood-burning stove for heat, and windows that rattled in their frames when the wind picked up through the towering Douglas firs that surrounded the property. Hazel was 29 years old, a botanical illustrator who worked from home, creating detailed drawings of native plant species for field guides and educational materials. The isolation suited her perfectly. She needed quiet to focus on her work, and the forest provided endless inspiration and subject matter. Her nearest neighbor was nearly a mile away, down a rutted dirt road that turned to mud during the frequent rains. Hazel had adopted a dog 6 months after moving into the cabin. Max was a 3-year-old German Shepherd mix she had rescued from a shelter in Vancouver. He was well-trained, protective, and provided both companionship and security in the remote location. The cabin sat on 2 acres of partially cleared land, surrounded on 3 sides by dense forest. Hazel had installed a long cable run that stretched from the back porch to a tree at the edge of the clearing, allowing Max to be outside safely while she worked. The system worked well during daylight hours, but at night, Hazel preferred to keep Max indoors. The forest was home to bears, cougars, and coyotes, and she worried about him encountering wildlife in the darkness. The routine on the night of the incident was the same as every other night. Hazel worked late at her drafting table, finishing a series of illustrations of native ferns. Around 11:30, she saved her work and began preparing for bed. Max was lying on his cushion near the wood stove. But when Hazel stood up, he trotted to the back door and whined, signaling that he needed to go outside one last time. Hazel hooked his collar to the long line and opened the door, watching him bound out into the darkness. The night was clear and cold, with stars visible through gaps in the tree canopy. She left the porch light on, but closed the door to keep the heat inside, planning to check on Max in a few minutes. She was washing dishes in the kitchen when she heard the familiar scratch at the back door. Max always did this when he was ready to come inside, dragging his claws down the wooden door in a distinctive pattern. Hazel dried her hands and walked to the door, but something made her pause. She couldn't explain it rationally, just a sudden feeling that something was wrong. Instead of immediately opening the door, she leaned forward and looked through the peephole. What she saw made her heart stop. A man was standing on her porch, hunched over slightly, staring intently at the door handle. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face partially hidden by a hood. His hand was on the handle, testing it gently, as if checking to see if the door was locked. Hazel froze, her hand still on the deadbolt she had been about to unlock. For several seconds, she simply stood there, unable to process what she was seeing. Then she heard the scratch again. It hadn't been Max at all. The stranger was dragging his fingers down the door, mimicking the sound her dog made when he wanted inside. The realization sent a wave of terror through her body. This person had been watching her. He knew her routines. He knew how Max signaled to come inside. He was using that knowledge to trick her into opening the door. If she hadn't looked through the peephole, if she had simply opened the door as she did every night, the stranger would have been standing right there, separated from her by nothing but air and opportunity. Hazel backed away from the door slowly, trying not to make any sound that would alert the stranger that she knew he was there. Her phone was on the kitchen counter. She grabbed it with shaking hands and called her husband Marcus, who was on a work trip in Portland and wouldn't be home until the weekend. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. She whispered frantically that someone was on the porch, that Max was still outside, that she didn't know what to do. Marcus was immediately alert, telling her to stay away from the door and stay on the line with him. He was trying to think, trying to come up with a plan from 200 miles away while his wife stood in danger. That was when Hazel remembered Max was still outside with a stranger. The thought made her physically ill. If the stranger hurt her dog, she would never forgive herself. But stepping outside would mean exposing herself to danger. The back door opened directly onto the porch where the stranger stood. There was no way to reach Max without passing within feet of the intruder, but the cabin had a second entrance, a side door that opened into a small mudroom used for storing firewood and tools. That door led out to the side of the house where the ground was covered in gravel. If she could open that door quietly, she might be able to see Max, or at least determine if he was safe. Hazel tiptoed to the mudroom, wincing at every creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. She moved the firewood carefully to create a path to the door, then slowly turned the handle and cracked it open. The cold night air rushed in, and she peered out into the darkness. She couldn't see Max anywhere in her limited field of vision. The dog might be at the far end of his run, or he might have circled to the front of the house. There was no way to call him without alerting the stranger to her presence. She closed the door as quietly as she had opened it and returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Through the peephole of the back door, she could still see the stranger. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, still staring at the handle as if waiting. The patience was somehow more terrifying than if he had tried to force the door open. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was calculated. He had come here with a plan, and he was willing to wait for the perfect moment to execute it. Hazel considered calling the police. But what would she tell them? A man was standing on her porch. He hadn't broken anything. He hadn't threatened her verbally. He hadn't even knocked on the door. She could imagine the dispatcher asking if she had asked him to leave, if she had tried to determine what he wanted. The rural police response times were notoriously slow out here. It could take 30 minutes or more for an officer to arrive. Then the stranger did something that made Hazel's blood turn to ice. He looked directly at the peephole. She couldn't be certain he could see her through the tiny lens, but his gaze fixed on that exact spot. He knew she was watching. A slow smile spread across his face, revealing teeth that gleamed in the porch light. The smile wasn't friendly or reassuring. It was predatory, malicious, the smile of someone who enjoyed frightening others. He held that expression for what felt like forever, staring directly at where Hazel stood, frozen on the other side of the door. Then he opened his mouth wider, letting the smile transform into something grotesque and taunting, as if to say he knew she was trapped inside and there was nothing she could do about it. With that horrible expression still on his face, the stranger turned and walked away from the porch. Hazel watched through the peephole as he went down the steps and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the porch light. She didn't move for several minutes, afraid it was a trick, afraid he would come rushing back the moment she opened the door. Marcus was still on the phone, his voice urgent, asking what was happening. Hazel explained in a whisper what she had seen, and Marcus insisted she call the police immediately. He was already getting dressed, already heading to his car, already planning to drive through the night to get home to her. Hazel did call the police, and while she waited for them to arrive, she forced herself to go looking for Max. She grabbed a flashlight and a kitchen knife, unlocked the back door, and stepped onto the porch, with the knife held in front of her like a weapon. The clearing was empty and silent. She called Max's name, and to her immense relief, she heard barking from somewhere in the trees. She followed the sound and found Max tangled in undergrowth at the far edge of the property. His long line had been cut, the cable neatly severed about 6 feet from his collar. Someone had deliberately freed him from the run and chased him into the forest, removing him as an obstacle and eliminating Hazel's early warning system. The police arrived 40 minutes later. 2 deputies took her statement, examined the cut cable, and searched the property with flashlights. They found footprints in the soft earth near the porch, boot prints that suggested a man of average size and weight. They found additional prints near the tree line where Max had been found, and drag marks in the dirt, suggesting the dog had been grabbed and pulled into the forest. The deputies were professional and thorough, but they offered little hope of identifying the intruder. Without a clear description of his face or any physical evidence beyond footprints, there wasn't much they could do. They promised increased patrols in the area and gave Hazel a case number for her records. Marcus arrived home at dawn, exhausted from the drive, but furious and protective. He wanted Hazel to leave immediately, to pack her essentials, and stay with family in town until they could figure out a better living situation. But Hazel was stubborn. She had built a life here, a career here. She refused to be driven from her home by a stranger who might never return. They compromised by installing security cameras around the property, motion-activated lights, and deadbolts on all the doors. Marcus also purchased a firearm and made sure Hazel knew how to use it safely. These measures made them feel slightly more secure, but the sense of violation never completely faded. The stranger never returned, at least not that they could document. But Hazel never felt entirely safe in the cabin after that night. Every sound outside sent her pulse racing. Every shadow glimpsed through a window made her freeze. Max became more aggressive, barking at things she couldn't see, refusing to go outside alone, even in daylight. After 6 months of living in a constant state of anxiety, Hazel and Marcus made the difficult decision to move. They broke their lease and relocated to a house in a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Olympia, where neighbors were close and streetlights lit up the darkness. Hazel still works as a botanical illustrator, but she no longer seeks out the isolation of the forest. She works from her home studio with the doors locked and the curtains drawn, and she never opens the door without first looking through the peephole. Max is still with them, older now and more protective than ever. They take him on walks in public parks during daylight hours, but never at night, and never in places that feel too remote or too empty. Hazel shares her story with other women who live alone, warning them about the importance of security measures and trusting instincts. She knows how lucky she was that night. If she had opened the door without looking, if the stranger had been faster or more aggressive, the outcome could have been unthinkably different. The forests of Washington State are beautiful and majestic, but they also provide cover for those who hunt in the darkness. And Hazel will never forget the smile of the predator who stood on her porch and mimicked her dog scratching, waiting for her to make a fatal mistake. Story 6. The Chase on the Mountain. This happened about 4 years ago when Thomas and Claire, both 19-year-old college students, decided to explore the back roads near Mount St. Helens for a photography project. Thomas and Claire had been friends since high school, bonding over their shared interest in landscape photography and outdoor adventure. Both were enrolled at Western Washington University in Bellingham, studying environmental science and digital media respectively, and they frequently took weekend trips to remote locations to build their photography portfolios. The area around Mount St. Helens offered dramatic volcanic landscapes, old-growth forests, and abandoned logging roads that provided access to views most tourists never saw. They had spent weeks planning this particular trip, researching locations on satellite maps and reading trip reports from other photographers who had explored the region. They left campus early on a Saturday morning in October, driving Thomas's aging Honda Civic south on Interstate 5 before turning east onto the winding mountain roads that led toward the volcano. The weather was perfect for photography, with scattered clouds creating dramatic lighting conditions and temperatures cool enough for comfortable hiking. By mid-morning, they had left the paved highways behind and were navigating Forest Service roads that went from gravel to dirt to barely maintained tracks that threatened to scrape the underside of the Civic. Thomas drove carefully, wincing at every pothole and rock, while Claire navigated using a combination of GPS and hand-drawn maps they had made from satellite imagery. The location they discovered exceeded their expectations. A dirt road wound through dense forest for nearly 2 miles before coming out onto a ridge that overlooked a valley carved by ancient lava flows. The trees opened up to reveal Mount St. Helens itself, the crater clearly visible against the sky. Rolling hills covered in golden grass stretched below them, dotted by stands of alder and patches of volcanic rock. It was exactly the kind of dramatic landscape they had hoped to find, remote and beautiful, and seemingly untouched by human activity. They parked the Civic at a wide spot in the road and spent an hour walking around, scouting locations and taking test shots. Thomas focused on wide landscape compositions, while Claire photographed details, the texture of lichen on rocks, the patterns of seed heads in the dried grass. It was during their exploration that they first noticed the other vehicle, an old Dodge Durango. Faded blue paint covered in dust and rust sat at the edge of a small stand of trees about 100 yards from where they had parked. The vehicle looked abandoned, windows dirty, tires half deflated. They walked over to investigate, curious about why someone would leave a vehicle in such a remote location. As they approached, they saw a man emerge from the tree line carrying a large black trash bag. The bag was full of something bulging and heavy based on how the man carried it. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his 50s, with weathered skin and clothing that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. When he noticed Thomas and Claire watching him, he stopped walking. He didn't call out a greeting. He didn't wave. He simply stood there perfectly still, staring at them across the distance. The staring lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Thomas raised his hand in a friendly wave, but the man didn't respond. Claire suggested they head back to their car, and Thomas agreed. They walked back quickly, both feeling unnerved by the encounter, but trying to rationalize it. Perhaps the man was a hunter disposing of remains. Perhaps he was a hermit who lived in the woods and resented intruders in his territory. Perhaps he was simply unfriendly and suspicious of strangers. They got in the Civic and drove back down the dirt road toward civilization, joking nervously about the creepy encounter, but already making plans to return at dawn for better lighting conditions. They came back 2 days later, arriving at the location just before sunrise. The morning was cold and clear, with frost coating the grass and their breath visible in the air. They parked in the same spot as before and hiked up to a higher vantage point, carrying their camera equipment. The light was perfect, golden and soft, lighting up the landscape with the kind of quality that photographers dream about. They spent more than an hour taking photographs, completely absorbed in their work and the beauty of the location. It was Claire who first noticed the Durango coming down the dirt road. She pointed it out to Thomas, and they both recognized it immediately. The same vehicle they had seen before, the same vehicle that belonged to the man with the trash bag. The Durango drove past their parked Civic and continued to the end of the road, then turned around and parked directly behind their car, blocking them in. The driver didn't get out. Thomas and Claire were 300 feet away on the hillside, watching through their telephoto lenses as the man simply sat in his vehicle, engine running, making no move to leave or explain his presence. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Thomas suggested they should head back to the car, but Claire was hesitant. Something about the situation felt wrong. Why would someone deliberately block their vehicle and then just sit there? What did he want? They decided to wait and see if he would leave on his own. But another 15 minutes passed, with no change. They had no choice but to return to their car. They packed their camera equipment and started down the hillside, moving slowly and deliberately, trying to appear calm, even though both of them were increasingly frightened. As they approached the vehicles, they got a clear look at the man through the windshield of the Durango. He was staring straight ahead, hands on the steering wheel, making no acknowledgement of their presence, even though they were now close enough to make eye contact. Thomas and Claire reached the Civic and quickly loaded their gear into the trunk. The entire time, the man didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. Thomas got in the driver's seat and started the engine, expecting the man to pull forward and let them pass. Instead, the Durango remained stationary. Thomas honked the horn. No response. He rolled down his window and called out, asking the man to please move so they could leave. No response. Claire pulled out her phone to call for help, but they had no cell service this deep in the mountains. The nearest help was at least 30 minutes away, down terrible roads, and they had no way to contact anyone. They sat in the Civic for several more minutes, the tension building, before Thomas made a decision. He put the car in reverse, backed up as far as the narrow road allowed, then swung around the Durango by driving partially off the road through the grass and brush. The maneuver was risky, the Civic scraping against branches and rocking over uneven ground, but it worked. They got past the Durango and started driving down the dirt road. That was when the chase began. The Durango roared to life and came after them, closing the distance rapidly despite the rough road conditions. Thomas accelerated, pushing the Civic as fast as he dared on the rutted dirt surface. The car bounced and skidded, Claire bracing herself against the dashboard. Both of them terrified as the Durango filled the rear-view mirror. The driver was right behind them, sometimes only a foot or two away, his high beams on, even though it was now full daylight. Dust kicked up by their tires created a cloud that should have forced the Durango to fall back. But the driver maintained his position, refusing to let them escape. They reached the main gravel road, and Thomas turned right, hoping the better surface would allow them to gain distance. Instead, the Durango accelerated and pulled alongside them, driving on the wrong side of the road. Thomas looked over and saw the driver staring at him. And then the man held up a knife, a large hunting knife with a curved blade, pointing it directly at Thomas through the window. Claire screamed. Thomas swerved right, nearly running into the ditch as the Durango drifted into their lane. The driver was trying to force them off the road, using his larger vehicle as a weapon to run them into the trees. They came to an intersection with a paved highway and a traffic light that was just turning red. Thomas ran the light without slowing, blasting through the intersection and earning an angry horn blast from a logging truck that had to brake to avoid hitting them. For a moment, Thomas thought the Durango would stop at the light, that the presence of other traffic would end the chase. But the driver didn't stop. He ran the red light 2 seconds behind them, ignoring the logging truck and the laws and any sense of reason. The chase continued onto the highway at speeds that climbed toward 100 mph, the Civic's engine screaming in protest. Another red light approached ahead. Thomas calculated the distance and the timing and made a split-second decision. He floored the accelerator and they shot through the intersection just as the light turned red. The Durango was 2 seconds behind them, too committed to stop. A car entering the intersection from the side hit its brakes and honked. The Durango swerved to avoid the collision, overcorrected, and slammed into the guardrail in a shower of sparks and debris. Thomas didn't stop. He kept driving, checking his mirrors obsessively until they reached the town of Castle Rock, where cell service returned. Claire called 911 with shaking hands and reported everything that had happened, while Thomas pulled into a busy gas station parking lot, surrounded by witnesses and safety and civilization. The police found them 20 minutes later. Thomas and Claire gave statements describing the chase and the knife and providing the license plate number Thomas had memorized. The officer took notes and seemed to take their reports seriously, which was a relief after how helpless they had felt during the chase. The follow-up call came later that afternoon. The Durango's driver had been arrested at the scene of his crash. He was intoxicated, had multiple outstanding warrants, and was being charged with assault and reckless endangerment. The officer also mentioned that when police searched the crash site and the area where the Durango had been parked, they found evidence of illegal dumping and possibly other criminal activity. Though he couldn't provide details about an ongoing investigation, Thomas and Claire never went back to that location. The photographs they had taken that morning remained on their memory cards, technically excellent images that neither of them could bear to look at without remembering the terror of the chase. They finished their photography projects using images from other locations and gradually stopped taking weekend trips together. The experience had changed something fundamental about how they viewed remote wilderness areas. The solitude and beauty that had once attracted them now felt dangerous and exposed. They wondered sometimes what was in those trash bags the man had been carrying. They wondered what would have happened if they hadn't escaped. They wondered if anyone else had encountered that man on that lonely road, and whether everyone had been as fortunate as they were. Those questions haunt them still, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. A reminder that the most dangerous predators in the wilderness often walk on two legs and hide among the trees where the roads end and civilization fades away. Story 7. The neighbor at the end of the road. Charles and Paisley had been married for 3 years when they decided to rent a house on a dead-end road bordering Colville National Forest in eastern Washington. The decision to move there had been driven by practical considerations as much as romantic ideals. Charles worked remotely as a software developer, and Paisley was a freelance writer, which meant they could live anywhere with reliable internet access. The rural property they found advertised online seemed perfect. A 2-bedroom house on 5 acres at the end of a quiet road, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, with rent that was half what they had been paying for their cramped apartment in Spokane. The landlord, an elderly man who lived in town, assured them it was a safe neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. What he failed to mention was the property at the very end of the road. Another 20 acres of land that bordered the national forest. They moved in during early spring, delighted by the abundance of wildlife and the pristine beauty of the landscape. Deer grazed in their yard at dawn and dusk. Ravens called from the treetops. The silence at night was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines. They quickly met most of their neighbors, friendly families, and retired couples who had lived on the road for decades. Everyone seemed welcoming, except for the owner of the property at the end of the road, a man named Miller, who kept to himself and had a reputation for being territorial about his land. Multiple neighbors warned Charles and Paisley to stay away from Miller's property line, and mentioned he had threatened people in the past who accidentally wandered onto his acreage while hiking. The warning seemed reasonable. Rural landowners often valued their privacy, and Charles and Paisley had no intention of trespassing. 3 months after moving in, Paisley surprised Charles by adopting a dog without consulting him first. She had been volunteering at the Spokane Humane Society once a week and had fallen in love with a 9-month-old shepherd mix named Luna, who had been surrendered by owners who could no longer care for her. Luna was energetic, affectionate, and completely untrained. She barked at everything, pulled on the leash during walks, and had a habit of escaping the yard whenever she found a gap in the fence. Charles was initially frustrated by the impulsive decision, but Luna's enthusiastic personality won him over quickly. They enrolled her in obedience classes and worked on reinforcing the fence. Accepting that the training process would take time and patience, the problem began when Luna escaped the yard for the 3rd time in a week. Charles came home from a grocery run to find the gate swinging open and no sign of the dog. Paisley was still in town at a meeting, and Charles spent nearly an hour walking the neighborhood, calling Luna's name, before several neighbors told him they had seen the dog heading toward the forest at the end of the road. Charles's stomach sank. Miller's property was in that direction. and he didn't relish the idea of knocking on the man's door to ask about a trespassing dog. But Luna was family now, and he had no choice. Miller's house sat behind a chain-link fence that was sagging in places, the yard overgrown with weeds and littered with broken equipment and rusted vehicles. A hand-painted sign, wired to the gate, warned trespassers would be shot. Charles hesitated, then called out from the road, asking if anyone was home. Miller emerged from the house almost immediately, a weather-beaten man in his 60s, wearing stained work clothes. He walked to the fence and asked what Charles wanted, his tone making clear he wasn't interested in friendly conversation. Charles explained about the missing dog and asked if Miller had seen her. Miller admitted he had seen a dog running through his property earlier and had chased it into the forest. He made no apologies and showed no concern, suggesting Charles should keep better control of his animals. The interaction was tense but brief, and Charles left feeling unsettled but grateful the situation hadn't escalated. Paisley found Luna later that afternoon, wandering near the National Forest trailhead. The dog was muddy and exhausted but unharmed. They repaired the fence gap she had used to escape and hoped that would be the end of the incident. But that night, Charles woke at 2:30 in the morning for work, a habit he had developed to accommodate clients in different time zones. He made coffee, opened his laptop, and then glanced out the window toward the road. A vehicle was idling there in the darkness, not parked at a neighbor's house, not passing through, just sitting in the middle of the road outside their property with its engine running and headlights off. Charles watched for several minutes, confused, then grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The moment his porch light came on, the vehicle drove away quickly. Charles caught a glimpse of it in the moonlight. A white pickup truck. Miller drove a white pickup truck. The same thing happened the next morning. Charles woke at his usual 2:30 time, looked out the window, and saw the white truck idling in the road. This time he didn't go outside. He simply watched until the truck drove away 15 minutes later. When Paisley woke up, Charles told her what had happened, and they debated what to do. Miller hadn't done anything illegal. He was on a public road. He hadn't approached their house or threatened them. But his presence was clearly intended to intimidate, to remind them he was watching, to assert some kind of dominance or control. Paisley wanted to call the police immediately. Charles wanted to wait and see if it happened again, hoping Miller would lose interest and move on. It happened again the next morning and the morning after that. 5 mornings in a row, Miller parked his truck outside their house in the pre-dawn darkness and waited until Charles turned on a light or showed signs of activity. On the 6th morning, Charles had enough. He called in to work and told his supervisor he wouldn't be available until later in the day. Then he stayed home and prepared to confront Miller. At 2:30 in the morning, he saw the white truck pull up and park in its usual spot. Charles immediately got in his car, turned on his high beams, and drove toward the truck. Miller fled, speeding down the dirt road toward his property. Charles followed at a distance, memorizing the license plate, then turned around and drove back home. That morning, Charles and Paisley went to the sheriff's office in Colville and filed a formal complaint. The deputy who took their report was professional and sympathetic. He knew Miller by reputation, describing him as a problem individual who had multiple complaints filed against him over the years, but had never been charged with anything serious. The deputy promised to send a patrol to check on their property and to have a conversation with Miller about his behavior. Charles and Paisley felt slightly reassured, but not entirely confident the situation would improve. They were right to be concerned. Miller didn't appear outside their house again, but the harassment escalated in other ways. Paisley started receiving strange phone calls on her cell phone, calls from blocked numbers where no one spoke when she answered. Their mailbox was vandalized, knocked off its post, and left in the ditch. They came home one evening to find their trash scattered across the driveway. Bags ripped open and contents strewn everywhere. Most disturbing of all, items of Paisley's clothing began disappearing from the clothesline she used to dry laundry. Underwear primarily, but also a few shirts and a pair of pajama pants. They had initially blamed Luna for stealing clothes, but Luna had been inside the house when several items vanished. After 2 weeks of mounting anxiety, Charles decided to take action on his own. He woke at his usual early hour one Monday morning and saw Miller's truck parked in the road again. Instead of turning on lights, Charles silently put on dark clothes, grabbed his phone, and slipped out the back door. He circled through the trees and approached the truck from behind, staying in the shadows until he was close enough to photograph the license plate and see through the driver's window. Miller was sitting behind the wheel, staring at the house. In his lap was a pair of binoculars, and on the passenger seat, clearly visible in the glow of the dashboard lights, were items of women's clothing that Charles recognized as belonging to Paisley. He took several photographs, his hands shaking, then retreated to the house and immediately called 911. The police response was overwhelming. Within 10 minutes, 4 sheriff's department vehicles arrived at the property. 2 deputies stayed at Charles and Paisley's house to take statements and ensure their safety. 2 others drove to Miller's property to attempt contact. Miller apparently saw them coming and fled in his truck, leading deputies on a chase down Forest Service roads at dangerous speeds before being stopped and arrested. A search warrant was obtained for his truck and property, and what investigators found was deeply disturbing. Miller had been obsessed with Paisley for months, taking photographs of her through the windows of their house with a telephoto lens, documenting her daily routines, stealing her intimate items. His truck contained 2 knives, a handgun, a length of rope, duct tape, and a detailed map with their house marked and multiple routes through the forest highlighted. In his house, investigators found a room dedicated to his surveillance, with dozens of photographs of Paisley tacked to the walls and a journal filled with disturbing fantasies describing what he wanted to do to her. Miller was charged with multiple felonies, including stalking, burglary, and weapons violations. The prosecutor told Charles and Paisley that the evidence suggested Miller had been planning to abduct Paisley, possibly during one of Charles's late-night work sessions when she was alone and asleep. The thought made them both physically ill. They had been living next to a predator who was watching and planning, and they had been completely vulnerable. If Charles hadn't followed Miller that one morning and discovered the evidence in the truck, Miller might have acted on his plans. That realization haunted them constantly. They filed for a restraining order immediately and moved out of the rental house within a week, forfeiting their deposit and breaking their lease. They didn't care about the financial penalties. They needed to be far away from that property, that road, that forest where Miller had watched them from the darkness. They relocated to a small house in Spokane proper, surrounded by neighbors and streetlights and the comforting noise of urban life. Miller eventually pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 8 years in prison. Though both Charles and Paisley felt the punishment was insufficient for the terror he had inflicted, Paisley struggled with anxiety and intrusive thoughts for years afterward, requiring therapy to process the trauma of knowing she had been watched and targeted without awareness. Charles blamed himself for not calling police sooner, for dismissing the early warning signs as merely odd behavior rather than genuine threat. They share their story now with others who consider moving to remote properties, warning that isolation can be dangerous and that neighbors are not always trustworthy. They emphasize the importance of listening to instincts, of reporting suspicious behavior immediately rather than waiting to see if it escalates. and of understanding that predators often choose victims based on vulnerability and opportunity. The forests of Washington State are beautiful and offer a quality of life that many people seek. But that beauty can conceal dangers that show up when you're alone and far from help. Charles and Paisley survived their encounter with Miller, but they carry the psychological scars as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous wilderness is not in the forest, but in the human heart. These 7 stories from the Washington State rainforests remind us that true horror is not always supernatural. Sometimes the most terrifying things are very human. The isolation that makes these forests beautiful also makes them dangerous. The same trees that provide peace and quiet can also hide predators who use the remoteness to their advantage. If you found these stories disturbing and valuable, please share them with others who spend time in remote areas. The more people who know about these dangers, the safer we all become. And if you have your own experiences in isolated wilderness areas, we invite you to share them in the comments below. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and remember that not all dangers in the forest walk on 4 legs.